Maoist insurgency or people's war? Sue Lloyd-Roberts reports from the front line of Nepal's 6-year conflict, now in its most violent phase. And David Loyne reports from Cambodia on how that country's finest evergreen forest is being destroyed by illegal loggers. Welcome to Reporters, I'm George Alagaya. The Prime Minister of Nepal recently asked George W. Bush and Tony Blair to include Nepal in their war against terrorism. Sher Bahadur Dubba requested economic and military assistance to continue to fight the ongoing Maoist insurgency in the remote Himalayan kingdom. The 6-year-long so-called People's War entered its bloodiest period recently, claiming hundreds of lives. 6 months ago, the government declared a state of emergency and mobilised the army. Sue Lloyd-Roberts looks at the conflict, which has so far cost in the region of 3,500 lives.
For half a century, the mountains and people of Nepal have attracted tourists on whom the country now depends for economic survival. Little wonder that over the last 6 years, the government has drawn a veil over the terror stalking the country. Only now the number of killed is such that they must appeal outside for help. Seen here before the current state of emergency, which has forced them underground, Maoist performers explain to villagers about the People's War, which wants to abolish the monarchy and give power to the people. But more recently, politics and dancing have given way to violence. 50 years ago, Nepal was a feudal country cut off from the rest of the world. One of the country's leading editors blames today's events on the suddenness of change.
We immediately jumped into a modernized, developing world. And then we had 30 years of governmental autocracy ruled by the king, an absolute monarchy. Then in 1990, this reign of 30 years was released. Democracy arrived. But together with democracy arrived the market forces. Globalization was on, and highways were built all over the hills of Nepal. So the market ingressed into nooks and crannies. Together with that came satellite television in the more later years, which brought in incredible changes in the minds of people about what is feasible, what's possible, what's out there, what do we not have. These kinds of sociological waves that hit Nepal never got studied by our social scientists because we have very few social scientists. And so we essentially were a country in free fall.
The change is immediately evident if, like me, you've been coming to the country over the last 20 years. On arriving in the Himalayan kingdom of Nepal today, you're more likely to be met by a member of His Majesty's Armed Forces than by the traditional Namaste. Checkpoints and curfews have become routine. In downtown Kathmandu, there's a general strike. This month's strike, the 7th to be called by the Maoists, is due to last 15 days. Even though the Maoists have said that they won't harm foreign tourists, they're clearly too scared to come. Tourism is down by 50%. The country is verging on economic collapse.
We need development. We need hospitals. We need more schools for the children. We need that sort of infrastructure. Day by day, we could have developed. But now, all our basic infrastructure is being destroyed. That means our country is lagging day by day, years behind. That means, we are getting poorer and poorer. It's a tragedy for our country.
Kathmandu's main hospital takes in new victims of Maoist atrocities every day. The teacher whose legs were broken because he works in a private school. The bricklayer punished for working for a capitalist construction company.
The Maoists are terrorists. They do nothing for the country. They only bring violence. They're stopping all progress.
This shopkeeper had his head beaten and limbs slashed because he wouldn't pay protection money. He and his wife say they daren't return home. No wonder the Kathmandu Valley resembles one huge construction site. Those who can afford to are fleeing the countryside. But someone must be supporting the Maoist rebellion, now in its 6th year. Their program has obvious attractions for the millions who live below the poverty line. They promise land redistribution, abolition of the caste system, and equality of the sexes. A certain winner with the women here who carry the burden of the work. Nepal is the only country in the world where women die younger than men. It was the gender equality which attracted 20-year-old Junu Thapa to Maoism. Now a prisoner, she joined the movement when she was 18.
I joined the Maoists because at that time there was a lot of unemployment in my village. I could not afford a good education, and being a woman was another disadvantage. All the jobs go to the upper caste people, and we poor people were getting nothing. The Maoist commanders were educated people, men and women, and they impressed me, which is why I joined them.
Do you believe that Maoism is good for Nepal today?
The country is desperately poor, and the politicians are corrupt, and they betray the people. Women are particularly exploited by men, by society, and the caste system. We can only liberate ourselves through class struggle. We need to destroy the present capitalist system and evolve a system which is pro-people.
Despite the painted nails, Junu Thapa is the genuine article.
I saw this picture carrying our...
The colonel who arrested her shows me a captured photo album and a picture of her in combat gear and with a gun. She's second in command of her unit. He shows me other paraphernalia seized from the rebels, including guns, usually stolen from the police, the ingredients for homemade bombs, and the stuff of revolutionary idealism. I guess you don't get to see many of these in China anymore. Local people may not know of Mao's Little Red Book, but they do know that the only agents of the state they come across are taking bribes and stealing from them.
The
police go down to small shops and hotels in the village, take food and don't pay. People have gone out of business because of this. The other day, the superintendent himself came out and threatened me with a gun, saying that he had 40 armed men outside and made me hand over my money. What we're all saying is that if the police behave like this, people are bound to be attracted to the Maoists.
For 5 years, it was the police and not the army who were ordered to cope with the insurgency, with a brutality towards people which won even further support for the Maoists. It took a new king and government and a series of spectacular attacks by the rebels to change that.
The Maoists, they came from that hill, that mountain, and they come down and they come up and they attack and they fight in our post. Only 35 soldiers a year.
Last November, over 1,000 Maoists attacked the town of Salere, where there was a small army garrison. 4 soldiers were killed in the attack, 30 policemen, 3 civilians, and 150 Maoists. It was only after the attack here in Salere that the government finally admitted that the situation had got out of control. All along, the army had been saying that they should be deployed. Finally, the government agreed, and the day after the attack here, the state of emergency was declared. I was flown over the mountains and forests of western Nepal, which provide ideal cover for the rebels to attack targets like this telecommunications tower. We head for one of a network of army outposts, which now defend the country. The police have now moved up the hill to join forces with the army under a unified military command. Soldiers and police patrol the area together and carry out community service. The security forces know that local people need to learn to trust them if they're going to combat the rebels on the hills above.
They are at the top of the hill, and if when they fire from that place, and if we fire, they will run away.
So you're winning?
Yeah.
We move off to another valley where the brigade has been told of a village which is harbouring Maoists, and I join a cordon and search operation. The villagers deny the charge. So where are the Maoists getting their support from? Of course, they say the rebels are in the next village. It's impossible to know. But if the people here are uncertain who to join in this civil war, the soldiers move into winning hearts and minds mode. I'm mindful that the army also want to show us an acceptable face, and the scene would have been very different had Maoists been found. All the soldiers I spoke to were irritated that they hadn't been brought in earlier to cope with the rebels. The Brigadier General in charge of this area of Western Nepal agrees. I spoke to one of your young captains in one of the outposts this morning, and he said with great confidence that the army is winning. Are you?
Yes, ma'am. You know, I take care of 16 districts. I'm winning and very much winning. I know how much I have managed to damage this terrorist. And these terrorists in my region, they know it very well, how much they have suffered. So I'm very confident. The captain is quite right, ma'am.
But the general speaks for only one of 6 military areas in Nepal. As we leave, we hear of new fighting in the neighbouring district of Rolpa. There's been another attack on an army garrison, and 70 members of the security forces have been killed. The army claim to have killed 150 Maoists, but they limit access to the area. Before they can be buried, there's a glimpse of several bodies in civilian clothes. By the time we get back to Kathmandu, there are rumours of dozens of innocent people killed. It's hard for anyone to know quite what's going on. Journalists who have reported from the Maoist side have been arrested, and all casualty figures come from the government.
But very few of us journalists are actually venturing out among Maoist areas. Yes, it is dangerous. And yes, there are problems. But when there is a war on, you have to have war correspondents. But sadly, in Nepal, we really don't have war correspondents. We do not know at this point how many of the people that are being reported killed, 15, 20, 30 every night, how many of them are civilians caught in crossfire, how many of them are mistaken civilians, civilians mistaken as Maoists, and how many of them are only Maoist sympathizers, and how many of them are in fact die-hard Maoist guerrillas out with a gun, in which case they are fair game.
Amnesty International has condemned the abuses under the state of emergency. It says that extrajudicial killings and kidnappings are being carried out by all parties. These photos are of a villager suspected of being a Maoist who was allegedly tortured and murdered by the army. These have been given to me by a prominent human rights organization in Nepal. They say they've been threatened by all sides and they don't want to be interviewed and want to remain anonymous. Such is the fear and lack of freedom of speech which prevails in the country under the state of emergency today. The victims in all this are the people, caught between attacks and then counterattacks. Just 2 hours' drive from Kathmandu, in the Dholaka district, trees are felled across the road to impede soldiers and police intervening in the People's War. A rebel pipe bomb has destroyed a bridge, leaving bus passengers stranded. A power station has been firebombed, delaying by years any chance of electricity being extended to the villages. And a farming research centre is burned down simply because it was run by government employees.
The Maoists came at night and took away useful things like typewriters, and then they torched the place. Afterwards, they asked us to join the revolution and fight with them.
But they refused to join them. They say they're fed up with the destruction, and the question I want to ask the Maoists is, how long can they carry on blasting the country's infrastructure to bits and expect popular support? But since the state of emergency, anyone having contact with the rebels can be arrested, with the exception of human rights activists like Bal Krishna Sharma. He knows that the Maoists come to this tea house and he leaves a note from us with the owner requesting a meeting. After a few days, we get a response.
Hearty greetings, our friends from the British Broadcasting Corporation. We received your letter and we'd like to warmly welcome you to Nepal. As per your request.
But they say that the recent army activity has made it impossible to find a safe place to meet, and we must wait. More urgently, they ask us to pass on a message to the government that they want to resume the talks that were broken off last year. I go back to Kathmandu to pass the message on to the Prime Minister, Sher Badhour Doba. Is he prepared to reopen talks with the rebels?
I don't think so, no.
It's too late.
Too late. No, they will regroup again, they will strengthen their position again, and they will attack again. Because they are not sincere, you know. One day their leader speaks one thing, tomorrow they change his statement. How can you trust them?
Are you not disappointed, given that we allegedly declared war on terrorism after September the 11th, that countries like America and Britain haven't given Nepal more help?
I would strongly put this point. Nepal.
To President Bush and Prime Minister Blair?
Yeah.
Do you think they'll listen?
Since they have assured Nepal, since they are leading the coalition against terrorism. Terrorism not only in Afghanistan, terrorism is here also, you know. Terrorism everywhere.
They should listen.
Yeah, they should listen. They should help.
And so, emboldened by the expected help from America and Britain, the Prime Minister says there'll be no talks and the army will be reinforced. There's more at risk here in Nepal than the quelling of a mainly rural insurgency. Democracy here is only 12 years old, and there are rumours circulating Kathmandu that if the situation gets worse, Parliament itself could be suspended. But even if it doesn't come to that, new concepts like democracy, the rule of law, human rights and press freedom are all at risk. The army is asking for helicopters, weapons and up-to-date communications from Britain and America, and is recruiting another 5,000 men. They warn that it could take another 10 years to make the hills of Nepal safe again. Human rights organizations warn that there'll be more detentions and more deaths, but few independent witnesses to record them.
Sue Lloyd-Roberts reporting there. The donors who finance Cambodia's development are preparing for their annual meeting next month. They're expected to be considering imposing tough conditions on the government for failing to crack down on illegal loggers. Cambodia has some of the finest forests remaining in Southeast Asia, but despite attempts to improve conservation, the temptation to make a profit has prevented conservationists from doing anything more than delaying destruction of the forests.
Deforestation Cambodia style. This is one of the largest evergreen forests still standing in mainland Southeast Asia. And it's disappearing in front of your eyes. Prey Long is not just another forest. A decade ago, there was a proposal to make it a World Heritage Site, giving it UNESCO protection like an ancient monument. Now one part of it has become so degraded that they're pulling it all down to make way for a commercial plantation, farming rubber at a time when the world rubber price has halved. Outside this limited area, there's a complete ban on all logging in the forest because the logging companies refuse to draw up proper forest management plans. But they are continuing to cut down the trees. The only change since the ban is that they are doing it just a little more discreetly. This dangerous-looking practice is actually an ancient woodland industry. A controlled fire stimulates the production of resin. But every time he comes into the forest, Noah Pfahl fears the loss of another of his trees. He says that if he loses his trees, he will have no way of earning a living. The resin trees are protected by law, but the laws do not seem to be working. Villages could soon need food aid as the forest disappears around them. The NGO Global Witness have been given a unique status in Cambodian government, being looked at as a model for other developing countries.
And that's the GPS position of this tree.
Yep. They're supposed to monitor the work of the government's forestry inspectors. But since the forestry inspectors don't move against the big business interests which own the logging concessions, Global Witness have moved into a more front-line role. These trees have been cut in defiance of the ban.
This was cut just within days. It's still very clear, liquid.
5% of the people are making a lot of money on the natural resources. Right now, it's the timber. The next thing I believe is once the timber's exhausted, it'll be the fisheries. But you have the 95%, the people we've been seeing over the last 2 days, who are the ones who are losing.
The catastrophic destruction of Cambodia's forest is happening despite government claims that it's stopped. And what makes the destruction of this resource even more tragic is that the loss is irreversible. After seeing clear violations, thousands of trees cut down despite the ban, and the cutting of resin trees in the rubber plantation area, Global Witness go to see the local forestry inspector.
Now the resin trees are being cut, I can't comment. That's a decision above me.
Now, if the law doesn't specifically say you cannot cut resin trees except in this or that area, then it's an absolute.
If the resin tree's in the rubber plantation area, then it has to go when they start clearing the land.
Not as many trees are being lost in Cambodia as when there was war, but there is clearly big money at stake here, and the monitoring is only delaying, not halting the destruction. Conservation makes no commercial sense. One senior figure in the logging industry admitted to me that civil servants are routinely paid off. The corruption is obvious and open. Deep in the forest, at an altar prepared by their ancestors, the people who thought they owned the forest until now turn to their gods for guidance. They've tried the World Bank and the big international donors, the US and Europe, but all that's been done has been to slow down the destruction. David Loyne, BBC News, Prey Long Forest in Cambodia.
And that's all from Reporters for this week.